Imagine watching the love of your life, the person you built dreams with, transform into a stranger before your very eyes. Sarah Williams once believed in the magic of love, in the strength of shared struggles. She and Thomas had started with nothing, scraping by with hope and determination. But when success came, so did change. The man who once cherished her with every glance had become a ruthless businessman, obsessed with prestige and status, blind to the sacrifices that built his empire. But one fateful night, a single, unexpected incident shatters the illusion Thomas has wrapped himself in. A forgotten debt, painful truth, and a confrontation that will force him to face the one thing he's feared all along, the reflection of his own heart. Stay stunned because you won't believe what happens next. But if it's your first time here, kindly subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated on our next upload. Now let's dive into the full story. Sarah Williams stood at the top of the grand staircase, a glass of champagne in hand, watching the anniversary party below. The chandelier above cast soft, golden light across the crowd of distinguished guests in designer gowns and tailored suits. Laughter rippled through the air, but Sarah's fingers trembled as they gripped the glass. Beside her, Thomas adjusted the cuff of his pristine white suit, his expression one of quiet triumph. "Everything looks perfect," he murmured, his gaze sweeping the ballroom. "Tonight will prove to everyone how far we've come." Sarah forced a smile. "Yes, perfect," she echoed, but her words tasted hollow. Her eyes drifted to the opulent decorations, the silver trays laden with hors d'oeuvres, and the live orchestra playing softly in the background. It was a far cry from the cramped one-bedroom apartment where they'd started their lives together. Back then, they'd shared meals on a cardboard box, their laughter filling the room despite the empty refrigerator. Her fingers brushed the locket hidden beneath her dress, its weight pressing against her chest like a secret. Inside was a photograph of them from those days, smiling, young, and hungry for a better future. She glanced at Thomas, his jaw set, his posture exuding confidence, and wondered if that man still existed beneath the layers of success and pride. In the kitchen, Maria balanced a tray of wine glasses, her hands trembling from exhaustion. At 17, she had grown accustomed to long hours of work after school, but tonight felt heavier than usual. Her mother, Rosa, the head housekeeper, watched her with a worried frown. "Mihija, you're swaying on your feet," Rosa said softly, setting down the silver platter she had been polishing. "You should rest." "I can't, Mama," Maria whispered, her voice tinged with desperation. "The chemotherapy bills keep piling up. I have to work." She straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. "Besides, Mrs. Williams has always been kind to us. I want to help make this night special for them." Rosa sighed, her face lined with fatigue from her own battle with cancer. She reached out to steady her daughter, but Maria was already moving toward the ballroom, her tray balanced precariously. Unbeknownst to them, Sarah had overheard their conversation. Standing just beyond the kitchen door, her heart ached with guilt. Rosa had been a pillar of strength for their family for years, and now she was suffering in silence. If only Thomas still remembered what it meant to be part of a family. Thomas stood near the grand piano, basking in the admiration of their guests. 20 years, he said, raising his glass. And every one of them a step closer to the success we always dreamed of. A few guests murmured their congratulations, but Sarah noticed the flicker of unease in their smiles. She stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Thomas, don't you think it's time we acknowledged the people who've supported us along the way?" Her tone was light, but her meaning was sharp. Thomas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Of course," he said smoothly, raising his glass higher. "To everyone who has helped us build this life. Thank you." The words were empty, Sarah thought, her stomach twisting. She turned away, her gaze falling on Maria as the girl entered the room with a tray of wine glasses. Maria's face was pale, her movements shaky. Sarah's pulse quickened. She had seen exhaustion like that before, in Rosa years ago when she had stayed up all night to care for their feverish son. The tray wobbled in Maria's hands, and time seemed to slow. The crash of shattering glass echoed through the room as the wine spilled across Thomas's white suit. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and Maria froze, her eyes wide with horror. "You incompetent fool!" Thomas's voice cut through the silence like a whip. The room fell still as his words hung in the air. Sarah's heart plummeted. Across the room she saw Claire, their youngest daughter, retreating into the shadows, her face crumpling with tears. Alex, their son, stood rigid, his jaw clenched. But it was Rosa's reaction that made Sarah's breath catch. The older woman stepped forward, her posture straight despite the weariness in her eyes. "Mr. Williams," Rosa said quietly, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "It was an accident. Maria is exhausted." Thomas turned to her, his face hard. Exhausted. Perhaps if she were more competent she wouldn't be. Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp. "Thomas, enough." The room seemed to hold its breath. But Thomas simply turned away, his expression as cold as stone. Sarah clenched her fists, her mind racing. Something had to change. Tonight had to be the beginning of it. Maria hurried out of the ballroom, her heart pounding as the weight of humiliation pressed down on her. The spilled wine, Thomas's cutting words, and the sea of judgmental stares all replayed in her mind. In the quiet of the hallway, she leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she fought back tears. "Mama was right. I should have rested," she whispered to herself, her voice breaking. But how could she rest when her mother's treatments depended on her wages? The image of Rosa smiling weakly as she endured another round of chemotherapy filled her mind. Maria straightened, wiping her tears. She wouldn't let one mistake stop her. In the ballroom, the tension lingered like an uninvited guest. Sarah forced herself to smile as she reassured guests that everything was fine, but inside, anger simmered. Thomas was speaking with one of his business partners, his demeanor calm as if nothing had happened. But Sarah saw the tightness in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders, signs he was barely holding his temper in check. She approached him, her voice low but firm. "We need to talk. Now." Thomas glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Not now, Sarah. I'm in the middle of an important conversation." "This can't wait," she insisted, her hand gripping his arm. "Unless you want your temper to ruin more than just your suit tonight." Reluctantly, Thomas excused himself and followed her to a quieter corner of the room. The moment they were alone, Sarah turned to him, her eyes blazing. "What were you thinking speaking to Maria like that? She's a child, Thomas. And Rosa." Thomas held up a hand, his expression impatient. "She's not a child, Sarah. She's an employee. And if she can't do her job, she's Rosa's daughter." Sarah interrupted, her voice trembling with anger. "The same Rosa who stayed up all night nursing Alex when he had that fever. The same Rosa who fed us out of her own kitchen when we couldn't afford groceries. Have you forgotten everything she's done for us?" Thomas's face hardened. "That was years ago. Things are different now." "Different?" Sarah's voice cracked. "No, Thomas. You're different. The man I married would never have treated her this way." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or the memory of the man he used to be. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by the steely resolve that had become his armor. "I've worked too hard to let anyone undermine what we've built," he said coldly. "This isn't about Rosa or Maria. It's about respect, and tonight they showed none." Sarah stared at him, disbelief washing over her. She realized then that the man standing before her was a stranger. In the kitchen, Rosa found Maria sitting on a stool, her hands trembling as she sipped a glass of water. "Mi hija," Rosa said softly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" Maria nodded, but her voice was shaky. "I'm fine, Mama. It was my fault. I wasn't careful." Rosa knelt in front of her, her eyes filled with concern. "You're too hard on yourself, Thomas. He forgets himself sometimes. Don't take his words to heart." Maria looked away, her throat tightening. "It's not just his words, Mama. It's the way he looks at us like we're nothing." Rosa's heart ached for her daughter. She had seen Thomas's transformation over the years, how success had hardened him. But she also remembered the man who had once thanked her with tears in his eyes after she'd saved his son. That man was still in there, buried beneath layers of pride. People lose their way sometimes, Rosa said quietly. But they can find it again with the right guidance. Maria nodded, but doubt lingered in her eyes. Back in the ballroom, Sarah returned to the party, her emotions swirling. She spotted Claire sitting by the window, her knees drawn to her chest. "Claire," Sarah said gently, kneeling beside her. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Claire looked up, her eyes red from crying. "Why is Dad so mean, Mom? Why does he talk to people like that?" Sarah's heart broke at the question. How could she explain to her daughter that the man they once admired had let his pride consume him? She hugged Claire tightly. "Your dad isn't a bad person," she said, though the words felt like a lie. "He's just forgotten what's important. But we'll remind him, okay?" Claire nodded against her shoulder, but Sarah could feel the doubt in her small frame. As the night wore on, Thomas stood alone near the balcony, gazing out at the city lights. His reflection in the glass stared back at him, a man who had everything he'd ever wanted yet felt an emptiness he couldn't explain. For a moment, he thought of Rosa, of her quiet strength and kindness. He thought of Sarah's words, her disappointment cutting deeper than he cared to admit. But instead of confronting these thoughts, he pushed them aside, telling himself that he had done what was necessary to succeed. If only he could see how far he'd truly fallen. The morning after the party, sunlight streamed through the grand windows of the Williams mansion, but it did little to brighten the heavy atmosphere. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee untouched in her hands. The warmth of the porcelain did little to ease the chill she felt from the night before. Across from her, Rosa carefully folded napkins into perfect squares, her expression unreadable. Sarah watched her, guilt gnawing at her. She couldn't shake the memory of Thomas's words that had cut deeper than he likely realized. "Rosa," Sarah began hesitantly, breaking the silence. "About last night." Rosa paused, her hands stilling over the napkins. "You don't have to apologize for him, Mrs. Williams," she said softly, her voice steady but tired. "I've known Thomas for a long time. I've seen how he's changed." The words hit Sarah like a slap. Rosa's tone wasn't accusing. It was resigned, almost pitying. And that made it worse. "I don't know what to do anymore," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking. "He wasn't always like this. He used to be kind, humble. The man I married. He's gone." Rosa gave her a sad smile. "People don't lose who they are, Sarah. They bury it. Sometimes, all they need is a reason to dig it back up." Sarah nodded, but her mind was clouded with doubt. What reason could she give Thomas when he seemed so unwilling to change? Meanwhile, Thomas stood in his office, staring at the framed photos on his desk. One was of him and Sarah on their wedding day, their faces glowing with joy. Another showed their children, Alex and Claire, during a family picnic years ago. But his eyes kept drifting to the smallest frame, a faded photo of himself as a young man, standing outside a diner in a threadbare suit. He remembered that day vividly. The cold biting at his skin, the hunger gnawing at his stomach, and the desperation in his heart as he waited for a call about a job that never came. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was his assistant, reminding him of a meeting with investors. Thomas sighed and straightened his tie, pushing the memories aside. As he left the office, he passed Claire in the hallway. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketching something in her notebook. "Claire," he said, pausing, "shouldn't you be getting ready for school?" Claire glanced up at him, her expression guarded. "I'm waiting for Mom to drive me." Thomas frowned. "I can take you." Claire shook her head quickly. "It's okay. I'll wait for Mom." The rejection stung more than he expected. He opened his mouth to say something but closed it again, unsure of how to bridge the growing distance between them. In the garage, Maria was busy loading supplies into her car for a catering job. Her hands moved quickly, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop replaying the events of the previous night, the humiliation, her mother's quiet defense, and Thomas's cruel words. "Maria," Alex's voice startled her. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Hi," she said warily. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened last night," Alex said, his voice sincere. Dad was out of line. Maria looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to apologize for him." "I know," Alex said, his gaze dropping to the floor. "But I wanted to. You and your mom don't deserve that." Maria's lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you," she said quietly. As Alex walked away, Maria felt a small spark of hope. Maybe not everyone in the Williams family had forgotten what it meant to be kind. That evening, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She sat at her desk, pulling out a stack of old photographs. Among them was a picture of Rosa holding a baby Alex, her face lit with the warmth of a mother's love. Sarah placed the photo in an envelope, along with a note. The next day, she handed it to Thomas as he prepared to leave for work. "What's this?" he asked, glancing at the envelope. "Something you need to see," Sarah said firmly. "Take your time with it." Thomas frowned but slipped the envelope into his briefcase. As he drove to the office, his curiosity grew. When he finally opened it during a break, the sight of Rosa's face, young, smiling, full of life, took his breath away. Beneath the photo, Sarah's note read, "She was there when we had nothing. Who are we now that we have everything?" Thomas couldn't shake the weight of Sarah's note. The photograph of Rosa, smiling in her youth, felt like an anchor pulling him back to a time he had worked so hard to forget. He had been proud of how far he had come. Every achievement had been a battle, and now, as he looked at the life he had built, all he could see was the woman who had helped him rise from the ashes. As he sat in his car outside the office, the morning sun blinding him through the windshield, Thomas's thoughts spiraled. He tried to suppress them, but they clawed at him. Rosa, her face, her sacrifice, her quiet strength, refused to be buried in the past. He had never really thanked her. Never acknowledged the nights she had stayed up, watching over his son when they barely had enough to eat. Never thought of her as anything but a servant in their home, though she had been so much more. The guilt hit him like a tidal wave. He had been blind, too focused on his success to see the faces of the people who had helped him along the way. And now, as he looked at the photo of Rosa, he realized how badly he had neglected the one person who had given him a chance when no one else would. That evening, the tension in the Williams household was palpable. Sarah and Thomas barely spoke as they ate dinner. The silence stretched thin between them. Claire and Alex exchanged wary glances, the familiar warmth of family dinners long gone. Finally, as the meal came to an end, Sarah stood and cleared her plate. "I've been thinking," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of what she was about to say, "about what's been happening between us." Thomas looked up, startled by her sudden shift in tone. "What do you mean?" "I think we both know that we've been living in a lie," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "You've changed, Thomas. And I don't know how to reach you anymore." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had built his life on pride, on success, on a version of himself that was untouchable. But now, standing in front of Sarah, his wife, his partner, the woman who had shared his dreams, he felt a flicker of uncertainty. "I haven't changed," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've just grown." "Grown?" Sarah echoed, her eyes narrowing. "You've buried everything we once were. And now, you don't even recognize the people who helped you get here." Her words stung more than he cared to admit. He opened his mouth to argue, but the memory of the photograph surfaced in his mind. The image of Rosa, the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never realized how far I'd gone." The vulnerability in his voice startled both of them. For the first time in years, Thomas saw his reflection, not as a successful businessman, but as the man he had once been. The following day, Thomas made an unannounced visit to Rosa's home. He had spent hours thinking about how he would apologize, but now that he was standing in front of her, the words seemed inadequate. Rosa opened the door with her usual calm demeanor, but when she saw him, her eyes widened with surprise. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice soft but wary. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her gaze on him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice thick. "I've been a fool. I've spent years thinking I could erase my past, but I can't. And I owe you so much more than just a thank you." Rosa remained silent, her expression unreadable. "I should have thanked you years ago," Thomas continued, his voice cracking. "For all you did for my family, for taking care of my son, for everything you've done, and I never noticed. I was so blinded by my own success that I forgot the people who helped me get here." Rosa stepped aside, allowing him to enter. "You've always had a lot of pride, Mr. Williams," she said quietly. "But it's never too late to make things right." As Thomas sat in the living room, the weight of his past and his mistakes pressing down on him, he realized that redemption wasn't going to come easily. It would take more than words, it would take actions. "I want to make amends," Thomas said, his voice determined. "I want to start a foundation for families who are going through what you did. What we did. I want to make sure that no one has to go through this alone." Rosa met his gaze, her eyes full of quiet understanding. "I'm proud of you, Thomas. It's a good start." Sarah stood at the window of their home, watching as Thomas left the driveway. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure. This was a turning point. She pressed her hand to the glass, the faintest trace of a smile crossing her lips. There was hope yet. The following weeks passed in a blur for Thomas, but in a way that felt entirely different from the years before. He threw himself into the foundation, researching, planning, and attending meetings. Each decision he made felt heavy but necessary. His pride was no longer his shield. Instead, it had become a burden he was desperate to rid himself of. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas sat at his desk, gazing at the files spread out before him. The foundation was taking shape, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation he had had with Rosa. It had been a turning point, but it hadn't been the end. No, redemption wasn't something he could simply purchase or build from the ground up. It was something he had to earn, slowly, painstakingly. He couldn't help but think of the past, of how far he'd come, how his success had become a shield against vulnerability. But what did it matter if he had all the wealth in the world if it meant losing the people who mattered? He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the family photos on his desk. The image of Sarah, their children, it all seemed distant now. Like strangers he had once known but couldn't fully remember. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Sarah. "Dinner tonight? We need to talk." Thomas's stomach twisted. It had been weeks since they had really talked, since he had begun this journey toward redemption. It was one thing to make changes in his life. It was another to reconcile with the people closest to him. He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing his response. "Of course. I'll be home by 7. That evening, as Thomas entered the dining room, Sarah sat at the table, her expression unreadable. Her eyes were slightly puffy, as though she had been crying, but she didn't speak. She just waited, her gaze fixed on him. "Sarah," Thomas said softly, sitting down across from her. "What's going on?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving his face. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice low and measured. "About everything. About us." Thomas nodded, trying to suppress the anxiety rising in his chest. "I know I've made mistakes, Sarah. But I'm trying to change. You have to know that." She shook her head, placing the glass down on the table with a soft clink. "It's not just about you, Thomas. I've spent so many years supporting you, believing in the man I thought you were. But I don't know who you are anymore. The words hit him harder than he expected. His chest tightened, and he fought to keep his composure. "I'm still the man you married," he said, his voice betraying him. "I'm just trying to be better." Sarah's eyes softened slightly, but there was a distance between them now. "I don't know if you can go back, Thomas. I don't know if I can forgive you for everything. The way you treated Maria, the way you've treated all of us for so long. It's not just about what you've done, it's about who you've become." He swallowed hard, her words cutting deeper than anything he had ever faced before. "I can't undo the past, Sarah. But I want to make it right. I want to prove that I'm not that man anymore." She reached for her wine glass again, her fingers lingering on the stem. "I want to believe you, Thomas. But actions speak louder than words." The silence stretched between them, both of them sitting at the table, not knowing what to say next. Thomas wanted to reach out to take her hand and reassure her, but the chasm between them felt insurmountable. How had they gotten here? How had everything they had built together become so fragile? The next morning, as Thomas left for work, he caught a glimpse of Sarah in the kitchen. She was standing by the window, her back to him, but he could feel the weight of her gaze. It was a reminder that the road to redemption wouldn't just be about him. It would be about them, about earning back her trust, her love, and the connection they had once shared. As he stepped out of the house, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from Rosa. Maria's scholarship application was accepted. For the first time in a long while, Thomas allowed himself to smile. Thomas arrived at the foundation's temporary office early the next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was modest, with mismatched furniture and boxes of files stacked in every corner. It was a far cry from his lavish corporate offices, but somehow it felt right. This was a place for beginnings, not pretenses. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at his desk, reviewing the finalized details of Maria's scholarship. It wasn't just any scholarship, it was the Foundation's pilot program, offering full financial support for children of employees in crisis. Maria was the first recipient, but she wouldn't be the last. As he sipped his coffee, Thomas's thoughts drifted to the past once again. He remembered the late nights Rosa had spent caring for his feverish son, Alex, when they were too broke to afford a doctor. He remembered the way she always seemed to have a kind word, even when her own burdens were heavy. How had he forgotten all of that? How had he let himself become so blind? The sound of the office door opening pulled him from his thoughts. It was Claire, his daughter. She hesitated in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. "Claire," Thomas said, surprised but pleased. "What are you doing here?" She stepped inside, her movements stiff, as if she were bracing herself for something. "Mom said you were working on a scholarship for Maria." He nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "That's right. She's been through a lot, and this will give her a chance to focus on her future." Claire didn't sit. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and hurt. "Why now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you suddenly trying to fix everything? Do you think throwing money at Maria will make up for the way you treated her? Or the way you've treated all of us?" Thomas's chest tightened. He had been prepared for resistance from Sarah, but hearing it from Claire was a different kind of pain. "I know I've made mistakes," he admitted, his voice steady but soft. "But this isn't about throwing money at a problem. It's about doing what's right." Claire shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't get it, do you? It's not just about what you did to Maria. It's about how you've changed. You used to care about people, about us. But for years, it felt like all you cared about was impressing strangers." Thomas stood, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Claire, I'm trying to change. I know it's not enough to say it, but I'm working on it. This foundation, the scholarship, it's just the beginning." She stared at him for a long moment, her emotions warring on her face. Finally she nodded, though the skepticism remained. "We'll see," she said quietly before turning to leave. As the door closed behind her, Thomas sank back into his chair, his hands trembling. Change, he realized, wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about earning back the trust he had lost, one small step at a time. Later that day, Thomas visited Rosa at her home. The modest house was filled with the comforting aroma of homemade soup, and the sound of Maria's laughter echoed from the kitchen. Rosa greeted him with a warm smile, but her eyes betrayed her curiosity. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Mr. Williams?" she asked, gesturing for him to sit. Thomas hesitated, then sat on the worn but comfortable couch. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his voice earnest, "and to thank you for everything." Rosa raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "That's unexpected, but appreciated." They talked for hours, reminiscing about the past and discussing the future. By the time Thomas left, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Rosa's quiet strength and unwavering kindness reminded him of the man he had once been, and the man he hoped to become again. That evening, as he returned home, Thomas found Sarah waiting for him in the living room. She held a box in her hands, her expression unreadable. "What's this?" he asked. She handed it to him. "Memories," she said simply. Inside the box were photos, letters, and trinkets from their early years together. Each item was a reminder of the life they had built and nearly lost. As Thomas sifted through the contents, he felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah nodded, her eyes softening. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We still have a long way to go." Here comes to an end of part 1. If you want to continue enjoying the next part, then let's see your comment for part 2.